A single stained couch on the porch, a ketchup sandwich in your hand, and a rotary phone that barely worked. This meant you were poor in the 1980s. But how did these quiet little details come to define who had everything and who had nothing at all? Generic brand groceries were the quiet label of struggle in the 1980s. Walk into any store and you would see those plain white boxes with nothing but bold black lettering, cornflakes, macaroni, or just soup. No mascots, no cartoons, no sparkle. They sat on the bottom shelf like they were trying not to be noticed. But they were. Everyone saw them. Kids knew what they meant. If those showed up in your cart, you were not getting prizes in your cereal. You were just getting food. Some tasted okay. Some tasted like cardboard. But they filled the pantry. And that was the point. They were cheaper by quarters that mattered. Some families would peel off the labels just so the box did not scream. Others embraced them, one no-name can at a time. In school lunches, you hoped no one saw the off-brand cookies. You ate them fast, hoping they passed for the real thing. Generic brand groceries were not glamorous. They were not meant to be. But they were the invisible badge of getting by. And for the families that counted every dollar, those blank white labels were a quiet promise. You were doing what you could, and you were not alone. Hand-me-down clothing told a story stitched in faded colors and stretched-out sleeves. In homes where money was tight, new clothes were a luxury reserved for Christmas or growth spurts too dramatic to ignore. Everything else? Hand-me-downs, jeans worn thin at the knees, shirts a size too big, coats that smelled like someone else's winter. You learned to cuff sleeves and roll pant legs. You got good at pretending it was your style all along. Sometimes it came from older siblings, sometimes from cousins or neighbors. There was no shame at home, it was just life. But at school, it was different. Kids noticed. They asked where you got it. Or worse, they recognized it from someone else's closet. You laughed it off, or changed the subject, or just said nothing at all. You knew every patch, every stain, every repair your mom made after dinner. These clothes had been through it, just like you. And maybe they were not fashionable, maybe they sagged or pinched or hung wrong, but they lasted. And for families with more love than money, hand-me-downs were not second best. They were just what came next. And they carried you through, one button at a time. Homemade school lunches in washed-out containers were the unofficial lunchbox of every frugal family. Forget the cartoon thermos or the shiny metal lunch pail. If you were poor in the 1980s, your sandwich came wrapped in wax paper and packed in an empty margarine tub. Maybe the lid said country crock, but inside was leftover spaghetti or peanut butter crackers. You used the same container every day. The label peeled, the edges warped, but it worked. Your drink? Not a juice box. Maybe a reused jelly jar with watered-down Kool-Aid. You prayed it did not leak. In the lunchroom, you sat next to kids with perfectly packed snacks, cheese sticks, pudding cups, chips with real logos. You ate quietly, or fast, or not at all. But at home, it made sense. Those containers stacked neatly in the cupboard. Your parents washed them each night and packed them again with care. It was not about shame. It was about stretching every cent. And even though you knew it was different, you also knew it was made with effort, maybe even love. Those stained lids and handwritten notes stuffed under the sandwich were signs of sacrifice. And now, all grown up, they feel like something you miss. Furniture from thrift stores or curbside finds gave homes that mismatched charm only necessity could create. A sagging couch from someone else's garage sale. A wobbly coffee table rescued from the sidewalk. Chairs with mismatched legs or beds with slats that creaked under every turn. This was what made a living room feel lived in. There was no delivery truck, just a neighbor with a pickup, or a slow push down the block with a dolly borrowed from Uncle Joe. You sprayed it down, you wiped it twice, and you made it yours. Some pieces were covered in throws to hide the rips. Others leaned against the wall to stay upright. But they had character, stories, a past you never asked about. In kitchens, the table might have a burn mark or a dent from years of use, but it still held dinner. In bedrooms, dressers groaned when you pulled the drawers, but they closed eventually. New furniture was for people with money, For everyone else, you took what you could get, and you were thankful for it. Because when money was tight, having something, anything, to sit on was a win. You did not care how it looked. You cared that it worked. Limited access to cable television in the 1980s meant your world came through rabbit ears. You had the basics, network channels, maybe a grainy local station or two. But when friends talked about Nickelodeon, MTV, or the Disney Channel, you just smiled and nodded, pretending you knew what they meant. Your TV had an antenna wrapped in aluminum foil. Your Saturday mornings were for cartoons on the few channels that came in clear. You learned to adjust the rabbit ears just right, then sit perfectly still, because moving even an inch might send the screen back into static. You missed out on the cable exclusive shows, the big movie nights, the flashy channels with round-the-clock music videos. You got public access, reruns, and news that ended with the national anthem. At school, you heard about shows you never saw. You laughed along anyway. At home, you made the most of what you had. Limited channels meant fewer choices, but also fewer arguments. You watched whatever was on. You made it work. And you learned something strange. When there was only one option, it often became your favorite. The picture was not perfect, but it was yours. And sometimes, that was enough. Heating only one room in winter was not just a strategy, it was survival. The whole house might be freezing, but one space stayed warm. Maybe it was the living room with a kerosene heater. Maybe the kitchen with the oven door cracked open. You brought in extra blankets. You wore your coat indoors. Everyone piled in, like penguins sharing body heat. You did homework at the coffee table, ate soup from mismatched bowls, slept on the couch or a pile of comforters laid out on the floor. The hallway felt like Antarctica. The bathroom? A short, icy sprint. At night, the cold crept into your bones, but during the day, you all huddled in that one room like it was the center of the universe. Parents told kids to keep the door shut. Do not let the heat out. No one dared argue. It was about bills, about making it to spring. And even though it felt unfair at the time, it also brought people close. Literally, you learned to share space, to pass the time, to be warm in more ways than one. Heating one room was not ideal, but it was home, and somehow it got you through. Using public transportation exclusively meant your life moved on someone else's schedule. There was no jumping in the car for milk, no last-minute rides. You waited. At bus stops, on corners, in the rain, in the cold, in your Sunday best or your work shoes. The bus was never early. Sometimes it was late. But you waited. You held a pocket full of exact change. Maybe a transfer stub. You knew the routes like the back of your hand. You sat near the front if you were tired, in the back if you did not want to talk. You watched strangers argue, laugh, cry. You saw your city from a different view, block by block, stop by stop. Owning a car seemed like another world. Gas, insurance, repairs. Those were luxuries. The bus was what you had, and it was enough. Sort of. It got you to school, to work, to church. You learned to carry groceries in bags that would not break. You made friends with the drivers. You memorized delays. And when the ride was over, you stepped off into whatever came next. Public transportation did not just move you. It taught you patience, resilience, and how to hold on when the brakes hit hard. DIY haircuts at home were a gamble wrapped in a towel and held together by hope. The kitchen turned into a salon. A dining chair became the barber's throne. Mom or dad grabbed the dullest scissors in the drawer and told you to sit still. You did. Kind of. And snip by snip, your identity changed. Bangs went crooked. Sideburns vanished. One side always ended up shorter. They tilted your head like that would help. You watched the clumps fall, hoping for the best. Sometimes it ended in tears, sometimes in laughs, but most often in silence and a baseball cap. You went to school the next day pretending nothing happened, but everyone knew. They always knew. DIY haircuts were not about style. They were about saving $20 and making it stretch. Hair grew back, groceries did not. So you endured the bowl cuts, the buzz jobs, the two short layers that stuck out like antennas. You got used to it. And after a while, it became normal. A family ritual, a budget tradition. Looking back, those crooked cuts carried more than just uneven lines. They carried effort, sacrifice, and a strange kind of love that you only see when the hair starts to grow in. Limited or no air conditioning meant summer nights were a battle with the heat. The box fan sat in the window, humming like a tired engine, barely moving the thick air. You sweated through your sheets, drank warm water, slept with the lights off and the windows wide open, hoping for a breeze that never came. Some homes had one window unit, and it stayed in the living room. Everyone gathered there like refugees from the sun. No one moved. The couch was soaked in humidity. Tempers flared, ice trays emptied fast. You wore as little as possible, stuck your head in the fridge, and counted the hours until dark. At school, kids talked about central air. You could not imagine it. The idea of a whole house being cool felt like science fiction. You made popsicles out of juice in ice cube trays. You wrapped wet washcloths around your neck. You laid on the floor, hoping the tile was cooler than the bed. And through it all, you survived. Uncomfortable, sticky, and half asleep, but alive. No air conditioning was not ideal, but it made you tough, and it taught you how to endure heat, not just in your house, but in life. Shared bedrooms among siblings meant privacy was a myth and bedtime was an adventure. 2, sometimes 3 kids in one room, bunk beds, fold-out couches, mattresses on the floor. You learned to sleep through snoring, giggling, and whispered arguments over who stole the blanket. One lamp lit the room. One drawer held everyone's socks. If you wanted quiet, you closed your eyes and hoped for sleep. But there was love there too. Late-night stories, secret jokes, a flashlight under the covers. You made forts out of sheets and built walls with pillows, pretending they were rooms of your own. You learned to share without thinking, to wait your turn, to keep secrets. Sure, you fought. You drew invisible lines down the mattress. But you also looked out for each other, listened when someone cried, celebrated the nights when no one got in trouble. Those cramped quarters built closeness you never asked for, but maybe needed. And years later, you remembered those rooms not for the lack of space, but for the way they held you together. Shared bedrooms were loud, messy, and full of life. And even now, you sometimes miss what it meant to fall asleep beside someone who knew you by heart. Reliance on government assistance programs was not a choice. It was the only way to get by. Food stamps came in paper booklets, torn out in the checkout line with quiet hands and sideways glances. School lunches were free, but they came with their own kind of price. Standing in a separate line, hearing the whispers, seeing the looks. You carried a different card, a different meal, a different kind of burden. The people behind the counter never said anything, but you knew. Everyone knew. At home, government cheese filled the fridge. Powdered milk sat on the shelf. The pantry was stocked with cans stamped from surplus stores, beans, peanut butter, cereal that tasted like cardboard but kept you full. Your parents made it stretch. They made it work. And they told you to hold your head up, even when you wished you could vanish. Because pride does not feed a family. Assistance was not shameful. It was survival. It was how your shoes fit, how your stomach was full, how you still made it to class with something in your bag. And though some days it felt heavy, it also meant someone, somewhere, knew you were worth helping. Even when the world made you forget. Wearing patches on clothes was less about style and more about grit. Holes in the knees, sewn shut with denim cut from old jeans, elbows wearing thin, covered in colorful scraps stitched with uneven lines and quiet determination. Every patch was a story, a game of tag gone too far, a tumble off a bike, a season of growth that stretched fabric past its limit. You did not throw things out, you fixed them. Because replacing a pair of pants was not always an option. Your mom had a sewing kit in an old cookie tin, filled with thread that never matched and buttons that had seen better days. She worked at the kitchen table, bent over your clothes like a surgeon, making something broken last just a little longer. You might have felt embarrassed. You might have tugged your sleeves to hide the stitching. But those patches were love in disguise. They meant someone cared enough to keep you dressed, even if the clothes were tired. They meant you kept going. Sometimes those patches were loud. Bright fabric that clashed with the shirt, a cartoon print stitched onto plain denim, whatever scrap was closest to the sewing basket. And sometimes they were nearly invisible, matched carefully to hide what had torn. Either way, you knew where they were. You could trace each one with your fingers. They scratched a little when new. They softened over time. On cold mornings, you sat still while your mom pinned a square over a frayed spot, asking you to hold your arms up or turn around so she could get it right. It was uncomfortable, but it meant you were cared for. No one wasted thread on clothes they did not plan to keep, and no one stayed up late mending knees if they did not believe you were worth the effort. Some patches covered wear and tear, others covered stains you could never quite get out. But all of them did the same thing. They gave your clothes a second life, and in the process, they gave you a quiet kind of dignity. You might not have had new clothes, but you had something better. Clothes that were saved, like you, again and again. And in a world where appearances mattered too much, patches were the proof that making do was still doing enough. You were worn, but you were whole. Limited extracurricular activities were just another way the world reminded you what you could not afford. Other kids had piano lessons, karate classes, and sports teams with matching uniforms. You had afternoons at home watching TV or playing outside with a stick and a rock. Sign-up fees were too high, equipment cost too much. Even the rides to practice were out of reach if the car was needed for work. You brought home the flyers from school and left them on the table, hoping. Sometimes they just disappeared. Sometimes your parents gently explained that maybe next time meant probably never. You cheered from the sidelines, you watched from the crowd, and you learned how to clap with a smile even when your heart wanted in. It was not fair, it stung, but you found other ways to grow. You read library books, you drew comics in the margins of your notebook, you played tag until the sun went down, and maybe you missed out on trophies and tournaments, but you learned resilience, creativity, and how to find joy in the quiet spaces. You might not have worn the jersey, but you still showed up, and that mattered. Using layaway plans was how your family brought home the things they could not afford all at once. The process was simple but long. You picked something out, paid a little now, and waited. Every week or every paycheck, your parents went back to the store and handed over a few more dollars. The items stayed behind the counter, out of reach, until that last payment clicked everything into place. Maybe it was a winter coat. Maybe it was a bike for Christmas. Sometimes it was furniture or shoes or something that felt big, because it was. You did not get instant gratification. You got slow, hard-earned reward. There was no credit card swipe, no overnight shipping, just weeks of waiting, hoping, and counting. You learned patience. You learned value. And when that final receipt was signed, it felt like winning something impossible. Other families might have walked out with full bags. Yours walked out with pride. Layaway meant you were not giving up. You were building towards something, one payment at a time. And even now, when you buy something in full, you still feel that echo, the deep understanding that waiting made it sweeter. Homemade cleaning solutions were born from necessity, not Pinterest boards. You did not run to the store for name brand cleaners. You went to the pantry, vinegar, baking soda, lemon juice, and hot water. That was your cleaning aisle. Floors were scrubbed with water and salt. Windows sparkled from a vinegar and newspaper combo. Stains were tackled with whatever you had on hand, even if it was club soda or a bar of soap worn down to a sliver. Your mom had recipes memorized, passed down from her mom, who probably learned it from someone who survived the Depression. There were no colorful spray bottles or lemon-scented chemicals, just jars and rags and effort. And it worked. The house was clean, not just surface clean, but deep cleaned with elbow grease and frugality. The scent was not artificial, it was honest, and somehow it made the place feel even more like home. Because cleaning was not about appearances, it was about taking care of what little you had. Homemade solutions taught you that expensive did not always mean better, that old tricks still worked, and that sometimes The best kind of clean comes from the simplest mix of ingredients and willpower. Minimal holiday decorations did not mean less spirit, just fewer lights. No inflatable snowmen, no blinking rooftop displays, maybe a single strand of lights across the front window, half of them flickering, maybe a tree with sparse branches and mismatched ornaments, paper stars, popcorn strings, hand-painted bulbs that chipped year after year. You reused wrapping paper, saved bows in a kitchen drawer. Stockings were sometimes just socks. The gifts were few but thoughtful. A scarf someone knitted, a book from a yard sale, a secondhand toy wrapped with care. The meals were simple. Maybe a turkey, maybe just a roast chicken with canned corn and mashed potatoes. But there was laughter, there was warmth, there was effort. Other houses looked like magazine covers. Yours looked like a family doing its best. And somehow that made it feel more real, more honest. The magic came not from extravagance, but from intention. You learned that holidays were not about perfection. They were about showing up with what you had and making it matter. And even now, when you see a tree decorated with plastic snowflakes and faded tinsel, something inside you smiles. Because that was enough. And in your memory, it still shines. Limited access to new technology made you feel like the world was always 2 steps ahead. Your television had knobs, not remotes. Your family's microwave, if you had one, was the size of a suitcase. You watched classmates bring calculators to school while you still did math by hand. Video game consoles? Maybe you got one, years after everyone else, and only if it was on sale or bought secondhand. Computers were something you read about, or saw once in a library. Other kids talked about digital watches and camcorders. You had a cassette player that chewed up your favorite tape. But you learned to live without. You taped broken things, reused old gadgets, asked for help at the electronics counter, and prayed something worked. And even if your stuff was clunky, slow, or already outdated, it still felt like magic when it turned on. Because having less did not mean you cared less. It meant you valued it more. You made it last. You treated it like treasure. And you watched the future arrive through dusty screens and static buzz. New technology passed you by sometimes, but what you had still lit up your world. Secondhand school supplies were the quiet beginning of every school year. You did not show up with shiny binders or a full set of markers. You brought a pencil case made from an old zippered pouch, a backpack with one strap stitched together, notebooks with 3 pages missing, crayons that were already dull. The rulers were warped. The erasers chewed at the corners. But it worked. Your parents sent you with what they could scrape together, leftovers from the older sibling, donations from the church, or whatever the teacher could spare. You watched other kids unpack brand new supplies with labels still attached. You kept yours tucked away. You learned not to complain. And over time, you learned to make do. You shared. You borrowed. You figured it out. And maybe your name was not written in glittery pen, but it was there. In the margins, in the effort, in every page you filled anyway. Secondhand supplies did not mean secondhand dreams. They meant starting from behind but still showing up. Still doing the work. Still proving you were more than what was in your desk. Frequent moves or housing instability meant you never got too comfortable. Just when you started to settle in, the boxes came back out. New schools, new streets, a different room, if you had one at all. Sometimes you moved in the middle of the night, sometimes with a borrowed truck. You left friends behind, teachers, pets even. You learned how to pack fast, how to blend in, how to stay quiet and observe before speaking. Rent went up, jobs disappeared. Family members moved, and you moved with them. You slept on floors, couches, sometimes in motels. Home was a loose term, more about who was there than what it looked like. At school, you kept your head down. You did not decorate your locker, you stopped memorizing addresses, and when someone asked where you were from, you paused, because there was no short answer. But through it all, you kept going. You adapted. You figured out how to rebuild again and again. And every time you unpacked that last box, even if it was just for a few months, You called it home. Because you had to. Because that is how you survived. Absence of health insurance meant every cough came with worry. You did not go to the doctor unless it was serious. You did not get checkups. You got through. Headaches meant aspirin and a nap. Fevers meant cool rags and soup from a can. Broken bones? Maybe. If you could not walk on it, you might go. Otherwise, it was taped, iced, or ignored. Your parents did not talk about money unless they had to, but medical bills were always the unspoken fear. You knew someone who waited too long. You knew someone who got lucky. You knew it could go either way. Dentists were a rare visit. Glasses were repaired with tape. Every illness came with a dose of prayer. And if you did go to the emergency room, you braced for the bill before the diagnosis. But you learned to be tough. You learned to treat the small stuff at home. You learned to read symptoms like a second language. And even though it was risky and scary and never ideal, it made you aware of what you had, or what you needed, and how much a simple doctor visit could feel like luxury. Limited or no access to personal telephones meant communication was never guaranteed. In some homes, there was only one phone for everyone, mounted to the kitchen wall with a long, tangled cord and a rotary dial that made even quick calls feel like a task. You waited your turn. You whispered your conversations with one hand covering the receiver. If the bill got too high, it was cut off. Simple as that. In other homes, there was no phone at all. You walked to the corner store and used the payphone with a pocket full of dimes. Sometimes you called collect. Sometimes you asked someone else to make the call for you. Emergencies became logistical puzzles. Job opportunities were missed because there was no way to call back. School events were forgotten because the message never made it through. Friends with their own phones lived in a different universe, where connection was constant and convenience was normal. But for you, every call had weight. Every ring had meaning. And when someone picked up, it mattered more than it should have, because the line might have been shared. But the stories, the check-ins, and the whispered "I'm okays" were always personal. Using public libraries for entertainment was not just a pastime, it was a lifeline. When money was tight and options were few, the library was the one place where everything was free. Books lined the shelves, worn from years of use, spines softened by hundreds of hands. You checked out mysteries, adventures, how-to guides, anything to take you somewhere else. Some kids went there after school to read. Others just stayed to stay warm in winter or cool off in summer. The smell of old pages, the whisper of shuffling feet, the clack of the date stamp, it became familiar, even comforting. You learned to treat borrowed books like gold. Late fees were avoided at all costs. Librarians became gatekeepers of imagination, pointing you towards stories you would never afford on your own. There were movies too, old VHS tapes you could borrow for the weekend, and story time for little ones, community events in the back rooms. Sometimes it felt like the library was the only place that wanted you there, no questions asked. In a world of no, it was a yes, a sanctuary made of words and light, and for families with little, it gave them something no money could buy: access. Homemade toys and games were stitched, nailed, folded, and built from whatever was lying around the house. You did not walk into toy stores with a wish list. You walked into the backyard with a stick and your imagination. A cardboard box became a spaceship. A broom handle turned into a sword. Marbles, bottle caps, socks rolled into balls. Anything became part of the fun. You made slingshots from rubber bands and clothespins, dollhouses from cereal boxes, race cars out of scrap wood. You played outside until the streetlights came on, inventing rules as you went. Nothing was battery-powered. Everything ran on creativity. If a toy broke, you fixed it with tape, or wire, or glue stolen from your sister's school supplies. You did not have shelves of action figures or dolls. You had one, maybe two, that you treated like royalty. Board games were played with missing pieces and handwritten cards, but no one cared. The point was play, not perfection. And in making your own fun, you learned more than any store-bought toy could teach you. You learned how to create, how to pretend, how to turn nothing into everything. That kind of magic did not come in a box, it came from you. Extended use of household items meant nothing was disposable. Not a pan, not a chair, not a pair of shoes. You squeezed every bit of life out of the things you owned. The washing machine rattled and groaned, held together with duct tape and stubborn hope. The couch had springs poking through, covered by a blanket to save guests the surprise. Shoes were resoled, sewn, patched, and passed down. Coats had buttons that did not match. The TV sat on top of a broken one that had never been hauled away. The fridge leaked. The stove burned unevenly. But everything still worked, mostly. When something broke, it became a family event. Tools came out. Neighbors were called. Repairs were improvised with coat hangers, spare parts, and instructions you half remembered from your uncle. Buying new was a last resort, only after every other option was tried and failed. You took pride in making things last, in saying, "We've had this forever," with a smile, even if it creaked or buzzed or smoked a little when plugged in, because every item carried a history. And in homes where money did not flow, endurance was everything. Things broke, but you found ways to hold them together, just like yourselves. Community support networks were not just helpful, they were essential. When cupboards were bare and money had run out, you turned to your people. Sometimes that meant church pantries. Sometimes it meant the neighbor who showed up with a casserole and did not ask questions. Clothing drives, holiday food baskets, a ride to the job interview when the bus did not come, these were not favors, they were lifelines. You learned early that help was a two-way street. One week you were the one in need. The next, you were the one giving back, folding clothes at the shelter, or handing out soup on a cold night. Pride took a back seat to survival. And through it all, you discovered something rare: kindness without a price tag. These were not programs with logos. They were people, ordinary folks doing quiet good, moms who traded babysitting, elders who taught you how to patch jeans, strangers who gave because they remembered what it was like to have nothing. The system might have let you down, but your community did not. In a world that often felt cold, it was the warmth of those small human acts that carried you forward, reminding you that even with nothing, you were never truly alone. The Canoe Rental shack by the creek was not a business so much as a suggestion. A crooked sign, 3 boats tied to a tree, and a man named Gary who might have been there since 1948. Dad would slap a 20 into Gary's hand and say, "We'll be back in a couple hours," like it was no big deal. No forms, no helmets, no waiver. Just a paddle, a life vest that definitely had not been certified since Eisenhower, and you, wobbling into a canoe while Dad shoved you off the bank with one foot. Once you got going, though, it was quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you realize just how loud life usually is. Birds overhead, water slapping against the side, and Dad telling the same story about how he once saw a snapping turtle the size of a garbage can. You never saw one, but you wanted to. You learned how to steer, sort of, and how to duck when you went under a low branch too late. You got soaked, you laughed, and when you finally dragged the canoe back onto dry land, Dad would clap you on the shoulder like you had just completed Navy SEAL training. But if that creek showed you the earth, the next place aimed a little higher, right up into the stars. Saturday morning cartoons were not just shows. They were rituals. You would wake up at 6 or 7, bowl of cereal in hand, and stake out your spot in front of the television before anyone else in the house even stirred, pajamas still on, eyes still half shut. But you were ready. The networks fought hard for your attention. ABC, NBC, CBS, they all rolled out animated powerhouses like The Smurfs, He-Man, The Real Ghostbusters, Gem, G.I. Joe, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Each show had its slot, and missing one felt like missing a holiday. But for every golden episode came the heartbreak of your favorite show being bumped, or worse, replaced. The dreaded special news report could interrupt your flow like a slap to the face. You would sit there in disbelief as your cartoon got pulled for a political debate or weather update. No warnings, no mercy. Still, the lineup gave you something to look forward to all week, and for those few hours, everything felt right in the world. cartoons, cereal, and commercials that somehow got stuck in your head forever. Because let's be honest, there are still jingles from that era that we can sing from memory, word for word. Going to the gas station used to be fun. I am not even kidding. In the 1970s, pulling into a station was not just about filling up the tank, it was about what you got for free. Gas station giveaways were the absolute jackpot of roadside errands. You would get real glassware, like full-on drinking glasses with cartoon characters or sports team logos printed on them. There were dishes, figurines, tiny toys, even aluminum tumblers in wild colors. Some stations had full sets you could collect over time, which meant every gas stop felt like you were unlocking a new piece in the puzzle. Parents would even choose where to fill up based on who had the best freebies that week. And kids? We kept track. We knew which stations had the cool tumblers and which ones were slacking. Sometimes they even gave out trading stamps to go along with your haul, so it was a 2-for-1 deal. You might not remember the cost of gas back then, but you definitely remember that little thrill when the attendant handed over your freebie through the car window. It was like a tiny prize for just living life. But if you think that was exciting, wait until you hear about the one thing that made kids count down the days from summer to winter, flipping through pages and circling dreams. Speak and spell. A name so simple, you almost forget just how advanced it felt. This little orange learning machine had a robotic voice that felt both comforting and unsettling at the same time. The keys were rubbery. The screen was a small LED display, and the second it powered on, you felt like a kid genius. This was not just a toy, it was a computer. At least to us it was. And for a lot of people, it was the first time they ever heard a machine talk to them like a teacher would. It would ask you to spell elephant or photograph in that slow, mechanical voice. If you got it wrong, it would buzz like you had just activated some kind of self-destruct sequence. And if you nailed it, that same robotic voice gave you praise like it meant something, like it knew you. Speak and spell was part game, part lesson, and 100% magic. You did not need Wi-Fi. You did not need batteries half the time. All you needed was the imagination to believe that this talking toy was the smartest machine in the house. And sometimes, it probably was. Of course, intelligence was one thing, but style? That was another story. If you were the kid with this next item, everyone knew you had your life together. It was not advertised. It was not even on a main road. Just a crooked wooden sign and a driveway that dipped behind an overgrown hedge. But if Dad tapped the wheel twice and said, "Here we are," you knew it was magic. The model train store in the back of someone's garage was no bigger than a single-car stall, but inside, it felt like a kingdom. Shelves were packed to the rafters with tiny train cars, tracks, tunnels, even tiny trees with even tinier squirrels. The air smelled like dust and old metal, the kind of smell that never leaves your coat. You would lean in to watch the train circle a miniature mountain range while Dad made small talk with the gray-haired man in suspenders, who clearly ran the whole operation on nothing but love and nostalgia. "This one's from 1952, the man would say, handing Dad a coal car like it was a rare coin. You did not know what made it special. You just knew Dad's eyes lit up in that way he saved for fishing trips and baseball games. It was not just a store. It was a secret clubhouse for grown men who still believed in toy engines and pretend towns. And if you think that was charming, wait until you smell what comes next. Free popcorn at the furniture store. If your mom ever handed you a little green booklet and a stack of stamps at the grocery store, you already know where this is going. S&H green stamps were basically kid currency in the 1970s. Every purchase at participating stores earned you these tiny rectangular stamps. You would go home, sit at the kitchen table, and carefully lick and stick them into pages of a booklet like some kind of mini stockbroker. And the best part? You could buy things with them. Not just little trinkets either. We are talking about radios, toasters, blenders, even bikes if you had enough patience and pages. It was like unlocking treasure chests using grocery points. And moms? They took this seriously. There were strategies. They knew which stores gave out the best deals, and they would make the rounds like pros. For kids, it felt like a weird game of Monopoly, but real. Every filled booklet was a step closer to some magical reward catalog where you could flip through and dream big. You did not just shop, you invested. And if your family loved collecting things from everyday errands, you better believe gas stations were next in line to turn a pit stop into a treasure hunt. Before Fandango or streaming apps told us what was playing, there was the operator. And calling the theater was an event in itself. You would dial a number, usually a long one, and wait as a robotic voice or sometimes an actual person listed off every movie in Showtime like it was the State of the Union. Showtimes for the weekend of July 24th, Gremlins at 7:30, The Goonies at 9:15, Ghostbusters at 10:45. You could not skip ahead. You had to listen. Carefully, and maybe even write it down if you were planning a big night. If someone in the house picked up the phone while you were listening, forget it. You had to start over. And if you called during a busy hour, good luck hearing anything over the static and background noise. But it was still exciting. The build-up, the anticipation. You felt like you were about to join something important, something bigger than yourself. Because back then, watching a movie meant going somewhere. It meant tickets, seats, sticky floors, and that one kid who always threw popcorn. It meant magic. But if you wanted movie magic at home, you did not need a theater. You just needed to clear your schedule, grab the good blanket, and stake your claim on the couch. Phones in the 1970s were not private, not even close. They had cords, long spiral ones that stretched down hallways, wrapped around doors, and somehow always ended up tangled. Every house had one line, maybe two if you were fancy. That meant when the phone rang, it was anyone's guess who would answer and who would listen. If you were a kid trying to call a friend, you had to pass through a gauntlet of parents and siblings just to get 5 minutes of conversation. And if you were a teenager, good luck. Eavesdropping was practically a sport. Someone would quietly pick up another receiver and breathe like a horror movie villain. You would hear that subtle click and knew you were not alone. Get off the phone became a daily soundtrack, and heaven help you if someone else needed the line. I'm expecting a call meant you had to wrap it up, no matter what life-changing gossip you were in the middle of. There was no voicemail, no caller ID. If you missed a call, it was just gone. But if you wanted real independence as a kid, you had to earn it. And for many, that meant waking up while it was still dark, grabbing a heavy canvas bag and heading out into the cold. Owning a Trapper Keeper in the 1980s felt like owning a briefcase made just for kids, but with neon colors, Velcro, and personality. These were not just folders. These were statements. You did not just store your homework in a Trapper Keeper. You stored your identity. From bold geometric designs to wild illustrations of race cars, dolphins, or laser grids that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie, the outside of your Trapper Keeper said something about you. And that satisfying rip of the Velcro? That was music. It had pockets for pencils, slots for notes, compartments you never used but felt cooler just knowing they were there. There was something so absurdly organized about them that it made you want to turn your life into a schedule. You would write the dates on your notebook dividers, color code your subjects, and then forget all of it by Wednesday. But hey, the effort was there. You felt important carrying one around. It made you feel like you were growing up, and even if you never opened it for anything other than doodling weird cartoons during math class, it still felt like a win. But when it came to keeping track of things, there was one object that really made you feel like a collector, and not just of stuff, but of memories. The Kart Track with zero safety rules looked like it was built by someone who once saw a racetrack in a dream and then tried to recreate it with duct tape and a prayer. The sign out front read, "Family Fun." But you knew this was Dad's kind of fun. He paid cash to a man with a sunburn and a clipboard, and before you knew it, you were strapping into a plastic rocket with wheels. No seatbelt, no helmet, just a stern warning. Do not hit your sister. Dad, of course, was already in his own cart, revving the engine like it was the Daytona 500. The track was a cracked loop with grass growing through it and tires stacked too high as a boundary. The exhaust fumes were strong enough to water your eyes, and the cart screeched like a choir of angry lawnmowers. You skidded, bumped, and spun out more than once, But you never forgot the thrill, especially when Dad passed you on the last lap, one hand on the wheel, the other waving smugly. That victory lap? It lasted all week, and if you were lucky, he would let you stay just a little longer, because the community swap meet down at the church lot was about to open, and Dad never missed that one. There was no sound more powerful in the 1970s than the delicate, distant jingle of the ice cream truck. Except, it was not a jingle the way we hear it today through tinny speakers and digital loops. No, back then, the ice cream man had real brass bells. He would slowly drive down the block, gently ringing them by hand or with a string attached to the window. The sound was soft but unmistakable. It sliced through summer air like a siren of salvation. Kids would freeze mid-game, mid-bite, or a mid-sentence and yell, "Ice cream!" before bolting toward the noise barefoot, clutching whatever spare change they could dig up from a kitchen drawer or the couch cushions. The menu on the side of the truck was like a stained glass window of dreams. Push pops, rocket bombs, orange creamsicles. And if you were lucky enough to have a full dollar, you might even walk away with a cartoon character bar with gumdrop eyes that always looked just a little off. The magic was not just the treat. It was the chase, the chaos, the moment. You did not schedule a visit to the ice cream truck. You hunted it. But if you wanted to feel truly rich as a kid, it did not involve frozen sweets. It happened in the aisles of the grocery store, with something you could not eat, but you definitely collected. The Columbia House penny deal felt like a loophole in the universe. You sent in a little card, maybe glued a few stamps to it, and next thing you knew, your mailbox was blessed with 12 brand new cassette tapes, or compact discs if you were ahead of the curve, all for just 1 cent. 1 cent. It felt like a scam in your favor. No way this is real, you thought. But there it was. Whitney Houston, Prince, Bon Jovi, Huey Lewis, boom! Delivered to your doorstep like you were some kind of record label executive. Of course, the catch was that you had to buy more albums at full price later. Parents were suspicious. Some tried to stop you. Others fell into the trap themselves. It was like a rite of passage, a shared secret, a little music heist you got away with, until the bill came due, of course. Still, there was no denying the power of opening that box. Shrink-wrapped covers, that new plastic smell, your very own collection. But for real-time music discovery, you only needed one thing. 3 letters, 1 channel, and a whole lot of attitude. There was no intention to buy anything, and everyone knew it. The furniture store with the free popcorn machine was Dad's idea of a Saturday outing. You would walk in and get hit with that smell, leather, fresh carpet, and hot butter. Dad would head straight for the recliners, and you? Straight to the red and silver popcorn machine near the back. It was always humming, full of those little white bags that were supposed to be single-serve, but somehow you found a way to go back 5 times without getting caught. Meanwhile, Dad was doing his test sit. That meant stretching, sighing, and rocking the recliner back and forth like he was making a real decision. "Too stiff," he would say. "This one's a back killer." The sales guy always came over and Dad would nod along, arms crossed, like he was closing in on the deal of the century. But you knew he was not buying a couch, he just liked the idea of picking one. And that popcorn? It was better than movie theater popcorn because it was earned. All this to say, shopping never felt like shopping with Dad. It felt like a game. But speaking of buttons, lights, and games, let me tell you about the kind of place where Dad's inner nerd really came to life. The greatest performers of the 1970s did not always have their names on marquees. Sometimes they were just the neighborhood kids putting on a backyard circus or a homemade talent show. And it was epic. Someone would make a hand-drawn poster using crayons and tape it to every mailbox on the street. Another kid would bring out a wobbly card table and pretend to sell tickets. You had gymnasts flipping through hula hoops, magicians fumbling through card tricks, and singers belting out radio hits into a hairbrush. If you had a dog that could sit, that dog was now part of the act. And your little brother? He was definitely going to be the assistant, whether he liked it or not. These shows were never perfect. Costumes fell apart, music cut out, and someone always cried halfway through. But it did not matter. The parents sat on folding chairs or blankets in the grass and clapped like they were at Radio City Music Hall. It was community. It was chaos. It was childhood. And when the show was over, the kids would bow, proud and breathless. But the moment you stepped back inside the house, another kind of performance was underway, trying to sneak in a private phone call when the entire household was listening in. Taping songs off the radio was a sacred mission. You would sit for hours next to your boombox, finger hovering over the record button, praying that the next song would be the one. And when it was, you had one shot to catch it clean, no static, no interruptions, and above all, no DJ talking over the intro. But of course, they always did. The opening notes would hit, your heart would race, and just as you hit record, that was the latest from Madonna. Coming up next, we've got... And just like that, your perfect mixtape moment was ruined. You would yell at the radio like the DJ could hear you. Why? Why do you do this to me? It was a battle of timing and nerves. Some kids got sneaky and recorded during the night shift when the hosts were quieter. Others became masters of timing, predicting when the chorus would drop, when the ad break would hit. It took real skill. And even if you missed a few seconds of the intro, you still labeled the tape like it was gold. You were not just building a playlist, you were capturing a moment. Free music, sure, but earned through effort, patience, and pure willpower. And if you were serious about your song collection, you were not stopping at one track. You were building an entire soundscape, one emotional banger at a time. Some nights, it was the backyard. Other times, it was the town planetarium where the air smelled like metal seats and carpet glue. But either way, Dad made sure you always looked up. He would point at a blinking light in the sky and say something like, "That one's Venus," even if it was just an airplane. You believed him, because he said it with the same certainty he used when fixing the lawnmower. Sometimes he would bring out a telescope that never quite focused right, but it did not matter. You could see the moon, or at least a very bright blur that had to be the moon, and that was enough. He told you about constellations, meteor showers, and a comet he swore he saw when he was 12. The planetarium nights were just as magical. You would lean back in those creaky seats while the ceiling lit up with galaxies and a deep voice narrated the birth of stars. Dad would whisper facts like he had a PhD in astronomy, even if he probably read them from the brochure 5 minutes before. You did not go to learn. You went to dream. And the only thing better than dreaming about space? Digging through the universe of stuff at the local flea market the very next weekend. That high-pitched tone. You remember it. You might even feel it in your chest right now. The emergency broadcast system test did not care what you were doing. It took over everything. You could be watching your favorite cartoon, a family sitcom, or a game show with flashing lights, and suddenly the screen would freeze, a gray static box would appear, and that bone-chilling noise would wail through the speakers. Then came the voice. Always monotone. Always distant. "This is a test. This is only a test." Even though they told you it was just a drill, it still felt like the end of the world was knocking. You sat still, stared at the screen, and waited for it to go away. Some kids covered their ears. Others ran to find a parent. It was spooky in a way you could not explain. You did not know what nuclear war was, not really, but you knew this test meant something big, something adult, something terrifying. After a minute or two, it would vanish, and the show would come back on like nothing happened. But you felt different. That noise lived in your bones. Still, once the fear passed, you went back to being a kid. And in the 1970s, being a kid meant making your own fun, sometimes by putting on a show right in your backyard. Public service announcements in the 1980s were something else. You would be watching cartoons or a sitcom, then suddenly, boom. The screen would cut to a gray filter, eerie music, and a serious voice saying, "This is your brain. This is your brain on drugs." Or a crash dummy flying through a windshield, or a puppet warning you not to talk to strangers. They were dramatic, unsettling, and weirdly unforgettable. One minute you were giggling at Garfield. The next you were wondering if touching a light socket would make you disappear forever. These announcements were designed to scare you straight. And they worked. They haunted your dreams and followed you into adulthood. Some used animation. Some used real actors with tear-streaked cheeks and slow zooms, and all of them felt like they were speaking directly to you. But even with the ominous tones, there was something strangely comforting about them, like the world was trying to look out for you, even if it scared you a little. They were a strange part of growing up, and honestly, we would be lying if we said we did not remember them word for word. Still, if there was one thing that really balanced it all out, it was the glory of waking up at sunrise for the lineup of legends. The flea market at the county fairgrounds was not just an event. It was an ecosystem. Hot pavement under your feet, the smell of popcorn mixing with motor oil, and a wall of voices haggling like they were at a medieval bazaar. Dad had a game plan. He always did. First, a lap to scout. Then back around to make the real choices. You wandered behind him wide-eyed, marveling at tables full of license plates, rusted tools, vintage comic books, and a surprising amount of questionable homemade jerky. One guy sold nothing but bumper stickers with sayings that would get you sent to the principal's office. Another had rows of toy yo-yos. And even though Dad warned you, you begged for one anyway. It broke in 5 minutes, maybe 6, but you still carried it around like it was gold. There was always a booth with used records blaring classic rock through dusty speakers, and Dad would flip through the crates like he was searching for buried treasure. Every once in a while, he would hold one up and say, "Now this is music." You did not argue. Not when he looked that happy. And if you thought flea markets were a lawless land of loose change and sunburns, just wait until you hear about the Kart Track that somehow never got shut down. Halloween in the 1970s was not a trip to a pop-up shop for a $30 superhero suit. It was a challenge, a test of creativity, a race to see who could turn a cardboard box and some tinfoil into a full-blown astronaut helmet or a robot torso. You begged your parents for old clothes, rummaged through closets for anything with a weird texture, and repurposed kitchen utensils into alien antennas. And then there were the masks. You know the ones. Thin plastic with elastic bands that snapped after 2 wears, tiny eye holes that never lined up with your face, and a mouth slit so small you could not breathe without fogging up the inside. But still, when it came time to trick or treat, you felt invincible. You became someone else. There was pride in a homemade costume. Nobody else on the block had it. You made it, with your own hands, or with your parents' help after dinner. And if your costume got torn or the rain made the paint run, you just kept going. Candy was candy, rain or shine, store-bought or not. But if you really wanted to earn something sweet, and not just from a pillowcase haul, you had to do a little hustling of your own. That meant going door to door, not for candy, but for glass bottles. You had not lived until you beat the Oregon Trail without dying of dysentery. That was the holy grail of 1980s computer gaming. Those chunky gray computers in the school lab, that pixelated map, that relentless text box reminding you that little Timothy had broken a leg and your oxen just drowned crossing a river. Iconic. It was not just a game, it was survival. You learned real-life lessons in that pixel wilderness. Like how much meat you could carry back from a hunt, not much, or why you should never try to ford a river without thinking it through. And somehow, we were totally into it. The green and black graphics, the clunky keyboard, the fact that it felt like schoolwork but kind of fun. You would all huddle around one screen, a group of 5 kids making group decisions like mini pioneers, and somehow it felt like the fate of your wagon family actually mattered. It was your first taste of choices in gaming, your first little moral dilemmas. Do you trade clothing for bullets? Do you rest for 2 days? Or do you push on and risk everyone freezing to death? Still, once the school bell rang, it was game over. And if you wanted to know what was playing in theaters that weekend, you did not Google it. You picked up the phone. You knew a toy was unforgettable when it lingered in your dreams, or maybe your nightmares. Hugo, man of 1,000 faces, was that toy. It was not soft or cuddly. It was a bald, plastic, mannequin-style head with eyes that seemed a little too real. And you could change its face. No, really. You got this kit full of rubbery noses, scars, mustaches, eyebrows, eye patches, and even glasses to transform Hugo into anything from a movie villain to a Cold War spy. You applied the features with a kind of glue stick that felt halfway between a craft tool and something out of a mad scientist's lab. This was not a toy you brought to bed with you. It was one you studied, experimented with, maybe even tried to prank your sibling with. There was something fascinating and just a bit unsettling about it. And yet, you kept going back to it. You made stories around those disguises, invented entire secret agent missions with Hugo at the center. Back in the 1970s, your imagination did most of the heavy lifting. That was the magic. And if you really wanted to get creative, especially in October, you did not go to the store for a costume. You went to the kitchen junk drawer, the recycling bin, and maybe the attic. If even one of these memories hit home, drop it in the comments and be sure to like and subscribe so we can keep remembering together.